I'm delighted to introduce 2CV, who is a loyal sponsor of Asia Research Media, a regular speaker to these events as well. 2CV is an award-winning global research agency with offices in Asia, North America, and the UK. It specializes in understanding people to drive growth and ultimately help clients make their mark. So I have two speakers today, one and a half. We have James Redden, who leads 2CV in Asia. He will hobble up here briefly for an introduction. He's just had a hip operation, so we won't make him stand for 20 minutes. He's had a 2-decade career. He has helped numerous clients understand their target customers to grow businesses, and he has led agencies in the US and Singapore, and is at the forefront of developing 2CV's reputation as a leading boutique insight agency in the Asia region. And we have John Smetheram, yes, who's recently come to Singapore, and so we welcome him. He helps organizations achieve their strategic objectives by using data and technology. Sorry, that's not correct. You've been here a while. Recently to 2CV. That's where I got confused. He helps organizations achieve their strategic objectives by using data and technology to improve decision-making, drive action, and build brand equity. His experience spans the UK, Europe, and Asia, with a current focus on technology, gaming, media, and entertainment. So, round of applause for our next two speakers.
Thanks, Piers. Good to see everyone in person. I'll be speaking for a few minutes and I'll pass over to John, but we are talking today about our retail consumer experience. So what we'll be covering, covering the topic of Phygital, the shifting shopper sentiment, particularly in Singapore, so we've got some original research around that, how brands can optimise their customer experience strategy, what they want versus what they're getting with a focus on Singapore, some great examples and some not so great examples that John will take you through, and some final thoughts. So firstly, the topic of Phygital, which I love this term. I think it's instantly understood, and it's something that I hadn't known till recently, but it is popping up in a lot of business writings. So a quote around that. So it is a recognition of the idea of a combination of physical and digital customer behaviour as we lead into a purchase. And you can see a nice quote here from the CEO of Indigo Books, this idea that we do want evolved customer experiences, and it's often a combination of physical and digital that can deliver that. So summing up this idea of Phygital, and we say Phygital retail, but it's not just retail, but it's this blurring of the lines between physical and digital. And it is a recognition that we tend to use multiple channels when we shop. I think we all understand that, whether they're digital, whether they're physical touch points, and often they do integrate. And the technology is driving things as it tends to. So there's a lot of technology that's growing the ability for brands to provide really great customer experiences with that, particularly with that blend of digital and physical, so that the Phygital as discussed. But what this is doing is really raising the bar for consumer experience, and naturally that puts pressure on brands. So if you want to keep up, if you want to be at the forefront, then the pressure is on to get better and better because the technology is really evolving that. So next week, 2CV are talking all that matters. We're talking about the metaverse. So for example, that is an obvious umbrella of technology that will allow greater and more interesting and more immersive and more engaging consumer experiences. And also ideally frictionless experiences, because we find, as John will tell you later, that about the ease is one of the biggest, most important things for a customer experience. So some brands are doing it really well, some brands are not so well. A few examples to show you what we're talking about when we talk about Phygital. So Marks & Spencer in the UK have live video consultations that they've recently introduced, and an expert will broadcast a product demonstration. it can be passive for the customer. They can just sit and watch, but they can also interact. They can ask questions, and naturally they can buy if they're satisfied. So it's this idea of really replicating the in-store experience where you have access to an expert, you can see the product, you can buy the product, but of course you're doing it from the comfort of your home, of your personal device. IKEA is probably another one we've all seen, just a really great example of using augmented reality to what will this chair look like in my home? Does it fit? And then from there, I might decide to buy on the app, or I might decide to go into the store and spend my time to see it in person and buy it. So some nice examples. We contemplated on putting in some bad examples, but we won't name any names. I know I've had the experience a few times. A really classic fail from this Phygital execution is you say buy something online, and then it's click and collect, you get into the store and they don't have the stock. And I know that's happened to me a few times, and that's like a classic fail where there's no integration between the physical and the digital channels or touch points from within the company. And I think thankfully that is becoming a less common situation. So we're talking about retail. I think we think retail in this context, but across the clients we work with, consumer experience, customer experience is a priority, and I think we saw that from Piers' presentation earlier. It is a high priority. So whether it's a classic retail business or whether it's a finance company, whether it's a tech company trying to sell a digital product, most of our clients are coming and saying, hey, we need to understand the customer journey. We need to understand how we don't lose people, how we attract people, how we get the right messages to people at the right time through that journey. So as in response, we have developed a toolkit of research solutions to help our clients with regards to that. But what ultimately brands are trying to do, customers are trying to do, or clients are trying to do is understand where and how to invest in that customer journey, when it should be physical, when it should be digital, when it should be integrated to provide those great customer experiences. And I think the McDonald's example is a great example of making it easier for people. They don't have to wait, they can do it on their own time. And ultimately, of course, it's about increasing, whether it's market share, basket size, or whatever your business financial outcome is. So we have some original research that we'll take you through today. So I'll pass over to John for the rest of the presentation.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks, James. As James says, it's my pleasure this morning to really talk you through some very hot off the press data. So this was actually collected towards the end of August, early September this year. There's a lot of it, so we're just sort of presenting some of the top lines this morning. But what I think it really shows is that, you know, there is a real sort of importance on this issue at the moment. As Piers sort of alluded to earlier, we're seeing lots of data that, inflationary pressures are decreasing brand loyalty. So actually anything that you can do as an organisation to enhance that experience is really going to help you build your tribe, build your community, and have that equity going into the future. So in the current economic climate, we are seeing that brand loyalty cannot be taken for granted. So the overall brand experience really is crucial for retaining customers and getting new ones, increasing your market share. So this was a study conducted just in Singapore for the time being, and really what it is, it's a little bit of a diagnostic tool. And what we found is that inflation is affecting shopper attitudes and behaviours, so nothing revelationary there. But what I think it really does is speak to the fact that lots of people are concerned at the moment. Lots of people are impacted in a very real way about the money that they have and how they're going to spend it. So what we're seeing is that in Singapore, shoppers really are tightening their belts. So in the top left over there, we see the activities that people are doing more of. And in the top right, bottom left over here, things that people are doing less of. And there's a real sort of consistency in the theme there. So people are doing more bargain hunting, they're more likely to be cutting out non-essentials, and they're more likely to be budgeting. And they're less likely to be going out socially, buying impulse items and buying luxury items. So I think that really just speaks to the fact that the belts are being tightened. Now, what that means for you is that actually shoppers are becoming less brand loyal. and they really are just buying what they need. So 61% of shoppers in Singapore agree with the statement that the rising cost of living has made me less loyal to my favourite brands, and 73% agree that I'm buying brands that fit my budget, even if they're not my favourite. So in terms of what this actually means for you, in terms of how to actually optimise your experience strategy, shoppers prefer using a mix of channels. So sometimes online only, sometimes offline only, and sometimes, a lot of the time, a little bit of both. But what we really find is that depending on the category, depending on the activity that they're undertaking, there really are a lot of nuances. And it's these nuances that, if you can understand, are really going to help you optimize sales and optimize acquisition. So being able to tailor your approach accordingly is absolutely critical to maximizing ROI, whatever that I happens to be, whether it's branding, communication, investing in stores or online. It's really about having a tailored approach along all aspects where a customer will engage with your brand and optimizing that experience. Now, this, as a statistician by training, for me, is a beautiful slide. It shows a really nice distribution. And basically, it's a 100-point scale. And what we did is we asked people, are you the kind of person who prefers to buy things online? Are you the kind of person who prefers to buy things in person? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Are you a little bit of both? And I think what we're really seeing here is that general acceptance, that real fact that people want to and are accustomed to buying on multiple channels, multiple touch points, and actually the customer journey is non-linear. So there's a lot of going back and forth, there's a lot of switching between channels. Now, I think one of the really interesting things is when we look at generational differences. And what we can see here is that there's a really consistent trend across generations. So the hypothesis might be, well, actually, older people are going to be more likely to be engaged in face-to-face buying. Younger people are going to be more likely to prefer online buying. But we're really not seeing that. What we're really seeing is that there's a lot of consistency across generations. And for me, the really interesting thing is actually that little bump just to the left, which actually represents Gen Z. And what we're seeing is that with some younger consumers, there's actually a little bit of a preference emerging to have these experiential retail, having more experiential retail. This might be, coming out of lockdowns, the opportunity to actually go out, do things, experience things in a way that perhaps they weren't able to do previously, having that extra income. I think there's a lot to explore in that generational difference, and obviously experiential retail is a really important factor of that sort of strategy. Now, in the next few slides, what we do is we keep the thick blue distribution curve, just so that we can see what kinds of activities and what kinds of categories are abnormal, which are the activities and which are the categories that don't follow that bell curve quite so neatly. So looking at the kind of tasks that people prefer to do online, we see that generally when people want to do activities online, it's for these activities related to initial search and getting a bit of a macro view on a category, getting a macro view on a product. So things like looking for the product, learning about the latest products, comparing prices, finding the best deals, and learning about top-selling products. These tend to be favoured online. So the implication there is actually, is making sure that this information is quick and easy to find on your website or commerce platform. Where there's no clear preference, where there's actually a bit of a preference more towards a hybrid, sort of mixed approach, is learning about post-sale service, looking for available products, searching for alternatives, understanding feedback, getting a more detailed product overview, and really sort of comparing features. So once you're beginning to zoom in a little bit, I think shoppers tend to prefer not just using one specific channel. So I think the key takeaway there is to make sure that you've got consistent information, consistent experiences across channels to really give your customers, that consistency in experience for these kinds of activities. And then finally, the tasks where people prefer in-person is really zooming in again. So when they really want to get that more detailed understanding. So things like talking to a sales rep, taking a picture, learning about specific products in details, or really comparing products. These are where you have the opportunity to use your physical outlets to create a more comfortable environment that really sort of propagates, really promotes that more detailed, experiential retail. Okay. Now, in the next couple of slides, we've just looked at a couple of different categories. And what we can see here is that online channels are really preferred for things like booking flights, things like telecommunication, things like digital entertainment. So it's more or less what you'd expect there. Things that are very sort of digitally enhanced or sort of tech-driven. People tend to want these things online. Where we see that there's no clear preference tends to be where people are looking at physical goods and appliances. So I think this is your sort of more classic experience here, where people want to have that initial understanding online, but then, and we can see that it actually slightly favors towards the online, but more or less it follows a distribution, and there's a clear preference for hybrid, for using sort of both channels. And these kind of products, kitchen appliances, tech devices, personal beauty and grooming, sort of more physical media, and things like toys and games. And again, they really all follow a pretty consistent pattern there. And then finally, looking at the categories where people prefer in-person, what we can see is more or less follows the trend, but actually if you look at the far left, you can see that it sort of over-skews on the preference to buy things in person. And this is, interestingly, for things like fashion, clothing and accessories, and sports equipment and activewear, in addition to household groceries, which I think FairPrice might be here. There's that strong preference for buying things in person, even when there's sort of apps and things available. Okay. So in the next few slides, what we look at is what shoppers actually want versus what they're actually getting. So what we really did here is we looked at a whole lot of different factors that really consumers say are important to them when they're going to make a purchase. I think there was something like 30 different statements. And what we did is we looked at how they all grouped together, and what we found is that there's really 5 key themes that emerged from the data. And these aren't groundbreaking, they're not revolutionary. I think they'll be quite evident, but I think it really just serves the point in terms of what is actually important to people. So first of all, price. As we say, this is getting more and more important. You need to understand what price point to go into market with, and that's going to become more and more important over the next year or so. Trust, interestingly, was the second most important factor. And trust here is more about your organization's reputation, but also about the fact that you can actually trust that particular channel, that you can trust that particular retailer. Ease, I think, is a really important one. So anytime you're making a purchase, it needs to be frictionless, it needs to be easy, and time again, we see that ease is one of the most important drivers in terms of making a purchase decision. Now, interestingly, having the right choice and having the right display are important, but less so. And I know that in subsequent presentations, I think there will probably be more of an emphasis on these, and I think that's a really interesting thing in the difference between what consumers say they want and some of those behavioural drivers in terms of what will activate a purchase decision. But just here, what we're seeing is that really getting the price right, being a trustworthy brand, and making an easy, frictionless experience are really the key 3 things to focus on. And actually, we don't want to come here and recommend that you drop price. So this is why we're saying, do you know what? Getting the trust right and getting the frictionless experience right are the 2 areas that we think are most important. Now, what we did here, and again, what you'll see is a really consistent sort of pattern in the data here. And here we just looked at how satisfied consumers were across these different attributes in different product categories. And they're all very similar, actually, which shows that actually there are some differences, but generally what people want and what they're getting is in some ways inverse. So people say that price is the most important thing for them, and actually this is one of the attributes that they're less satisfied with. We see that trust is the second most important, and again, trust is an area where people don't intrinsically feel satisfied with purchases they've made. Ease is pretty much on par. So people want things to be easy, and more or less they're easy in a few different categories. Now, interestingly, choice and display are two areas where customers generally feel that their needs are being met, where they're being satisfied. And I think this is a really interesting area because of some of the behavioural drivers that can really optimise that. But again, we really see here that in terms of what's important to them and where customers are satisfied is actually a little bit different. So what we actually did is we used this data, we used this framework as a bit of a diagnostic tool to look at some brands across Singapore to see who was performing well and who wasn't. And what we found was that within each category, some brands really stood out as being leaders and some really stood out as being laggards. So we threw a lot of brands into this experiment, into this diagnostic. Some of them we're going to talk through today. But there's a lot more behind this. There's a lot more that can be explored. This is really just a sort of initial top-line discussion. So what can we learn from the best? So in the general commerce category, what we actually found is that Tangs, both in terms of their online store and their physical store, it really stood out as being a strong performer. So Tang's store is the dashed blue line going across the top, and their online store is the thick blue line. So there's something about Tang's, not just on a particular channel, where they're really having, strong effectiveness across a number of different factors. Now, interestingly, we also see that Amazon Prime in Singapore is performing really strongly. Slightly less so on price, it dips a little bit, but actually Amazon's scores are pretty consistently high. Now, we've taken the decision today not to name the worst performers here, but if you come and talk to us after, maybe we can share some of this information. But what we can do is we can actually look at the lowest performers, and that just really gives a sense of the divergent experiences that we see in the different categories. So the worst performer in this category was actually a pretty well-known e-commerce platform. You can see the brands that we considered. Okay. Now, interestingly, looking at the fashion and style category, what we really saw here was that both H&M and Uniqlo, they scored really highly, actually. But in both cases, we tested their physical and their digital presence, and it was actually their online presence that really scored highly. So, the customer experience of buying from these fashion brands through their apps, through their commerce, e-commerce, has actually been really effective across a wide range of metrics. Now, their physical stores also scored well, which shows that people do sort of bundle the brand together, and this is why getting the consistent brand experience is so important. Because if you delight someone on one channel, you want that to carry over onto other channels as well. But it wasn't close enough that we felt we could say that. So it's really quite clear in the data that there's a difference between the online offerings here and the physical stores. Now, interestingly, Uniqlo scored really high on trust. And we know that actually Uniqlo have been doing a lot of work on their sustainability mission, on their corporate reputation, and that, I think, will factor in a little bit into the data in terms of that overall messaging. Okay. And some of the other brands that we considered were Love Bonito, Shein, Zalora, and Vans. Now, interestingly, if we move then onto the sports and activewear category, this is actually quite different from the fashion category, insofar as the strongest scores here were for physical. not for online. So it was more about having the ability to actually go into these stores, experience the products, test them out, and it was for both Nike and Decathlon. Having this physical presence was really important. So, you know, the actual face-to-face experiential component of buying in this category is really important. And interestingly, what we see here is that actually for Nike, display. So this is the way we actually phrased this was so it wasn't just for, you know, UX. It was actually a set of questions that covered both online and offline factors related to display. But we actually see that Nike scored the highest score there across all brands that we measured in this study. And then the final category that we'll look at this morning is the technology and consumer durables category. So here we see that Best Denki actually had their online offering was the category leader with really high scores for trust, ease and display. Hardware Zone was, you know, the biggest satisfier in terms of price. And then interestingly, what we saw as the worst performer in this category was actually what you'd consider as a more traditional bricks and mortar store. Their online offering just wasn't effective. It didn't work. And this has really come through in the data, receiving some of the lowest scores that we saw, even though it's online, even though its physical store actually was quite high. So as I say, that's really just a sort of quick tour through some of the data that we've got. We really use this as a diagnostic tool, but I think some of the key thoughts that we've got in terms of what this means for you is that shoppers want to have easy and engaging Phygital shopping. It's at a very nascent stage, so Web3, Metaverse, you know, these are very emergent at the moment. But as tech evolves, consumers are going to expect you to be doing more in this space. So understanding what that thing is going to be increasingly important in terms of getting your strategy right. And there's lots and lots of opportunity. But what we're seeing is that even though tech is evolving, some brands don't even have the basics right. So our advice is pretty simple. It's to get the hygiene factors right. There's lots of data, there's lots of ways that we can help to understand that and optimize it. And then once you get the basic right, really look to new technology for enhanced experiences and really sort of be a leader in the Phygital space. Okay, thank you very much.
To CV in your presentation, I remember the chart that there was like an inverse relationship between the importance of attributes and the satisfaction. I mean, is that just down to the classic lack of reliability of stated importance, or what conclusions can you draw from that?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, I think I think one of the conclusions to draw from that is that actually what people think is important isn't necessarily what they're going to be satisfied with, right? So obviously there are some factors like price, which is going to be a main driver of whether someone would ultimately make a purchase decision, but everyone would always want the price to be lower, right? So yeah, I think there's quite a bit to unpack in some of the data, but it's just interesting, I think, the fact that it really is an inverse relationship in terms of what we're seeing. Yeah.
And just to add on, the fact that display was low stated importance, but we know from behavioural science that it actually is a big driver. I think supports that we don't always have it straight in our head what's driving our purchase decision, because I'm sure these customers say, oh no, these packs don't affect my purchase, but we know they do.
They do.
Yeah.
Martin?
Really interesting with the physical store versus the digital store, because you actually see some people contemplating giving up the physical store aspect for it, and almost in a way you kind of feel like that's a weight off their mind because the aesthetics, how it has to look. Do you actually feel that there's, from your research, do you feel like there was brands who, let's say provocatively, if you went to them and said, just concentrate on the digital store. The physical store is just the noose around your neck that you're dragging with you, but you can't fix. Do you actually think that there's that type of momentum for people to completely move into the digital space and lose the weight of the physical store?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think that's a really great question, because obviously, as you say, lots of brands would love to lose the cost of rent. But I think what we're finding is that using physical spaces in the right way is actually a major draw factor for different types of customer. And I think it's really about using the retail mix in the right way, because people want an experience now. If it's quite a transactional purchase they're making, I think the ease online is often the way to go. But I think for certain product categories, being able to actually go experience, I mean, this is a classic Apple or Dyson kind of store, being able to actually go in, experience the product, that's why you shouldn't just make the sort of call to shut it. I think it's making use of the space in the right way, because every brand wants to build a tribe, wants to build that equity and keep people coming back. So it's about using the different channels in the right way and really having a sort of consistent experience across them.
I was going to say there's probably clearer examples the other way, where you might remember that very low line, which was the traditional retailer, where they should just almost give up online because it's so terrible and just stick to the stores. And I know from Australia that a lot of the classic department stores that used to dominate retail in Australia, they tried to bring online and they just couldn't compete because it was just not well executed. And it was almost, hey, stick to your stores, let the online guys do the online, because you just can't compete, but your stores are your core. So maybe more obvious in the other direction.